Hello, everybody. We just can't do one of these things without a tech stuff up at some point. So hopefully that was it for the night and it's going to run smoothly from here on out. I can't see any of your faces, just the welcome screen and myself, but really lovely to be here with everyone. I would like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on Aboriginal land today. I am zooming in from Ngunnawal country and like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to the lands and the traditional custodians of all the places that you are. If you would like to acknowledge the country that you're on, you can pop that in the chat. And if you don't know the country that you're on, we are going to pop a link in the chat as well, where you can look that up if you would like to. In terms of housekeeping, you will have seen from the screen that was up when you entered that we're going to be using a little gadget called Slido to collect all of your questions. We've got two excellent presenters. And if you have questions while you're listening, you can pop those into Slido. You can also vote for other people's questions and vote them up or down so that we know which ones people really want answered and we can try and get to those. We probably won't have time to get to all the questions, but we'll get to as many of them as we can. And if you have any issues, we've got a few Australian Democracy Network people here, Isabella, Cheryl, and Tony. So you can just chat to them if you're having any drama because you can't hear or you can't use Slido, and they will make it all work for you, hopefully. So that's housekeeping, I think. As I was just trying to make Zoom reappear, all the notes that I'd made for myself so that I didn't forget any of the nuts and bolts for the day just got minimized somewhere among the 150 tabs I have open on my computer. So there may be something missing, in which case I'll come back to it. But we've got great presentations that we want to share with you tonight. Before we get to that, I wanted to just introduce myself and Australian Democracy Network and Our Democracy as a bit of context for where these two awesome pieces of research have come from. So my name's Saffron Zomer. I'm the Executive Director at Australian Democracy Network. And I'm so delighted to be Zooming with such a lovely big crowd to talk about these really important issues tonight. It's just amazing that people show up and make the time. Really, really appreciate it. So good to be with you. Australian Democracy Network is working for a healthy democracy that puts people and planet first in all of the decisions that we make together through our democratic system. So we bring organisations and people together so that we can have the collective power that's big enough to change a whole system. And one of the campaigns that we're a part of is Our Democracy, which is a wonderful collaborative democracy campaign that brings together over 30 different civil society organisations that work on a whole range of different issues. Right through from gun safety, gambling policy reform, nature conservation and action on climate, and also thousands of individuals who've joined our movement for a stronger democracy. So there are so many things that we could have tried to tackle first to make our democracy work better. And we spent a lot of time talking to experts and academics and people who research this stuff their whole lives, and community leaders and community organisations, and asked them what we needed to do first. What was the most pressing problem that we need to solve to make our democracy work better? And the clear consensus right across the board was that we need to deal with the problem of state capture or corporate capture, which is what happens when special powerful corporate interests have so much influence over our political system that they can get outcomes that prioritise their profits over the well-being of all of the rest of us. That is not the way our democracy is meant to work, and it's stopping us from getting the outcomes that we need on the most important issues on basically every challenge that we're facing today. So our democracy is a collective campaign that we've created to change that and make our democracy work for us again. The centerpiece of the work that we started to do was our framework for a fair democracy. So this is a package of policy reforms that we think, if legislated together, would totally transform our political system and make it work for all of us, not just the powerful few. But we also know that this isn't a problem that you can just legislate away. It has to come with a groundswell that leads to a complete cultural shift where none of the shenanigans that you're going to hear our presenters talking about tonight are tolerated by any of us anymore. So there are going to be real consequences for anyone who seeks to undermine our democracy through the tactics of state capture or corporate capture. And for that, we need to build a powerful people movement from all around the country. And it's just really exciting to see that that is already starting to happen. And if you're new, I haven't met our democracy campaign before, really hope that you will join us also, because we need everybody. Really excited to be growing so fast and really have an opportunity right now to make a big difference. So, quick introduction to our speakers. Two amazing people with us today. Alice Drury is a senior lawyer at the Human Rights Law Centre, supports the whole civil society sector to deal with regulatory challenges, changes to the rules that we have to comply with, and is a real deep thinker about human rights and democracy. We also have Scott Ludlam, who you probably mostly know as a former senator from Western Australia for the Australian Greens. In post-political life, Scott is now a researcher, writer, deep thinker and activist, and has made really significant contributions to this Australian Democracy Network report. Both Alice and Scott are going to summarise these really big pieces of research that they've just released in the last couple of weeks. Alice is a week or two ago, Scott's just yesterday. And I shouldn't say Scott's report, it's an Australian Democracy Network report. There were a few really significant contributors to that report that authored it together. Yeah, just we won't be able to cram in everything, but we'll definitely share links to the places that you can download the full reports, read them at your leisure. But this is just an opportunity for us to hear a summary from these amazing researchers and answer some of your questions about it. So I think that's enough chit chat for me, at least temporarily. Alice, are you ready to roll? Oh, Scott, you're going first.
Who's going first? Yeah.
Scott's going first. Okay, over to you.
Can do. Thanks so much, Saffron, and thanks everybody for joining us. We've got 285 people on the call, which is extremely gratifying. I think gives us a little bit of a hint that there's some interest about in what we're doing. I'm joining you from the unceded sovereign lands of the Jiringanj people of the Yuin Nation on the south coast of New South Wales. And we'll talk a little bit during the piece about land and its kind of primacy in the state capture story. I'm also joining you on an incredibly unreliable regional broadband connection. You might have seen me drop twice during Saffron's intro. So if I drop, they're generally short. I will try and regain my composure. If you can just hold patience, and I'll be back with you as soon as I can. If it gets real bad, Tony and Saffron can take over. But my name is Scott. I was formerly in the Australian Senate for 9 years, developed an interest in this topic over a long period of time, but haven't really had the time until quite recently to dedicate some proper energy to really unpicking it. And I think maybe that's going to be a bit of a theme for all of us this evening. There's some really seasoned campaigners on this call. I had a quick skim through. I suspect a lot of you are going to see either your work represented here, or you'll understand that you've seen and you've worked within various dimensions of the problem that we're describing. So without further ado, I'm going to do a quick screen share. I'm going to race through this, partly because I think a lot of this will be familiar, but also because the Q&A is where it gets really interesting. And we want to hear from Alice. Hopefully you can see that. You should be able to see the Confronting State Capture. That's the title of the report that a whole, Saffron's quite right. This is definitely not just me. There's a whole heap of co-authors and contributors. This is really a crowdsourced document. There's a lot of collective movement wisdom represented here. So let's kick off. Oh, and the website for the study is there now. A little bit about ADN. Saffron's given you the lowdown on where Australian Democracy Network has come from. Please join, follow on social media, and pitch in. The phenomenon we're describing, state capture, is probably most simply represented like this. It's a unique political dilemma or condition that occurs midway along the slide between corruption, as we would understand it, and oligarchy. It's a term that we first came across in use by the World Bank, and they were using that to describe what was happening to post-Soviet republics in Eastern Europe as the Soviet Union was disintegrating in the early 1990s. You were kind of having these nascent oligarchies forming amidst a flowering of democracy, parliaments being established, free media, civil society organizations. Both things were happening at the same time. More recently, it's come into very common usage in South Africa, where it was used by academics and opposition MPs and organisers to describe what had happened in post-apartheid South Africa, where they knew they were dealing with something much more entrenched and systematic than petty corruption. But they also continued to have the freedom to organise. They clearly weren't, you wouldn't describe South Africa as an oligarchy. It's got elements of both. There's a raucous free media. There's extremely vibrant civil society organisations, opposition MPs, and so on. So what we've done is looked at this phenomenon of state capture from a uniquely Australian perspective. How does it manifest here? And if it does, what do we need to do about it? And it's basically this phenomenon where powerful interests, whether it's families or religious sects, or in our case, very powerful economic sectors, have captured a significant fraction of democratic armatures or institutions and the media environment that surround them, such that they're able to influence affairs of state to their own interests, to private interests rather than the public interest. What it means is very significant for us, particularly in the teeth of a federal election. It means policymaking doesn't work the way most people believe it does, and neither do elections. No matter, one of the contentions of this report is that no matter who sits in the Prime Minister's office come the May election, the resources sector and the arms industry, which are the two sectors that we've kind of done a bit of a deep dive on in this report, they'll still have the numbers. Their power won't shift. The infrastructure of state capture will exist after the federal election, no matter who forms government. This is not a call to turn our backs on politics or the electoral system or the freedoms that we do have. It is the opposite of that. It's just a call to be well aware of what it is that we're up against. So what went live yesterday with a huge amount of effort by a large number of people was this document. It's 70 pages long. What is state capture? How is it defined in the literature? How does it operate in this country? And then 2 case studies. Fossil fuel industries is a subset of the resources sector. We've looked at coal and oil and gas, and the arms industry. And they're 2 topics that I think need to be seen side by side more often. And then lastly, what we do about it. The report is not prescriptive. The recommendations are brief. They take up 2 pages and they're very general. Saffron's already given you a hint as to what one of them is. So it's more about problem description or diagnosis, and then we're actually trusting people to be well aware of what can be done about it. So we don't go into so much detail there. But the deal is the rulemaking machinery of our states are the prize. And that's what makes this more systematic and more dangerous than corruption. And we've examined it through 6 different lenses, or kind of 6 different slices. We've cut these cross sections through the behavior of these powerful industries to give us a sense of how they operate. And that's the structure of what we're going to hand over tonight. And also we've kind of, if you've done any kind of campaigning work in the past, you'd be familiar with this idea of sources of power or pillars of support. Put your industry in the middle if it's doing harm to society, and examine or analyze, like, what are the factors that are holding it up? What does it depend on and rely on for support? And if you kind of wander around this clock dial here from 6 o'clock, you see that everything begins with land. And in this colony, all of the land is stolen. All of the resources are being ripped out of the ground without consent. And industry relies on these intermediaries, whether they be state agencies or anthropologists or environmental consultancies or land councils, with or without actual consent. Everything begins with land. Labor, the people who actually build and operate and maintain these facilities, Capital industry relies on banks and on financing and on insurance and on auditors and so on, all the money people, and customers. Crucially for the resources sector, their customer base is being wiped out by the clean energy technology or the clean energy revolution, which is partly what makes them so desperate. So state capture, and this talk is largely concerned with these three sectors that are painted in red. So industry itself, how does it function? And what are the entities that make up and maintain social license? So media, but also this little ecosystem of lobbyists and communications consultancies and polling companies and researchers and think tanks and people feeding ideas into the public debate. And finally, we look at government. So the actual state that's being captured, everything from political parties to various parliamentary institutions, the public service, but also, and this is partly what makes state capture so dangerous, if you capture a state, you can start having a hand in what laws courts are interpreting against your adversaries, whether it be the not-for-profit sector or campaign groups. You can start controlling the tasking of intelligence agencies and police. And that's where it gets extremely dangerous, when you can turn the armatures of the state against people who are trying to restore democracy. You get the sense of why in that first diagram, state capture is pictured as a slide, because unless you take it to hand, it becomes self-accelerating, and you do end up literally living in an oligarchy or worse. So we're concerned with these sectors that are mostly painted in red, and so we kind of pull apart the different actors in the ecosystem, who's doing the work, and you'll get a bit of a sketch of that, and possibly more detail than you wanted to know if you download the report, which the crew put into the chat earlier in the session. So this is going to be very much a superficial skim of what's in the study. So our first slice of the 6 is financial interventions. Earlier this month, we get this rear view look at those parts of the financial kind of influence of politics that political parties and industries and other entities choose to disclose. And as you will see, they're choosing to disclose less than half of the money that's flooding through our politics. Of the $63 million that went to the LNP that was disclosed, the sources of nearly $40 million of that, we have no idea who it was. And you'll still see some stories that are bubbling along. Of that, the fossil fuel industries, according to really detailed work by ACF, accounts for about $2 million that we know of. So they're relatively small amounts of money. In the larger context, our political parties are a pretty cheap date. To buy this kind of, it's not that you hand over a donation and then through some corrupt process you get your project up. It's more, this is the price of entry. This is how you get through the door to argue your case. For nearly, a little bit over $4 billion over 20 years, according to the Center for Public Integrity. And how it gets in, they split the money up along in consecutive donations or to state and territory branches. They split the money up into donations that are below the reporting threshold. And that's how much, that's one of the techniques they use to flood the political process with dark money that we just don't know where it's coming from. Both of the major parties and the nationals have these policy forums or business forums that they call them, that are basically just fundraising arms, but they're also places for relationship building and policy advocacy. And the price of access for the top tier of these policy forums is $110,000 a piece for the platinum access. So a company like Woodside buys access to both of the major parties' policy forums. Then they get invited to budget night dinner or the media ball or these specialized little rub shoulders with the minister or the shadow minister and put your point of view directly. Now, I bet none of us on this call, having access to between $25,000 and $100,000, have been to one of these meetings. They don't report minutes, memberships, or decisions. We just don't know what goes on in there. But that's one of the ways in which they're flooding the zone with money. The second way in which they do it is through this network of lobbyists. So companies can deal direct. These people all have each other's mobile phone numbers from the CEO level and the senior political level, or crossbenchers or backbenchers, or people in senior positions on committees, or advisors to those MPs. So they deal direct. They will walk the corridors of Parliament with pre-written amendments, lobbying to say, we've drafted this for you, don't even need to do it, pass this amendment for us. What's going on? that was weird. I'm not sure if you can hear me or not. It said I'd been
Yeah,
muted.
you're good, Scott. We can hear you.
I'm still here.
Yep.
The second way that they do it is through industry associations or peak bodies like the Minerals Council or APPIA or the Business Council of Australia. For the arms industry, it's a bit more diffuse and it's not as clear cut that they have a kind of single point of contact for themselves. But a lot of the other sectors, whether it's gambling or alcohol or some of the folk that Alice is going to be speaking of in a moment, will work through these peak bodies that are like trade unions for capitalists. They speak for whole industry sectors. Or the Business Council has pretensions to speak for the business community as a whole. They speak with a very loud voice. The Minerals Council, the MCA, early in Prime Minister Rudd's career, destroyed that career with an investment of $22 million over a period of about 6 weeks. So these peak bodies, when they really go to war and try and tear people down, they're actually very capable of doing that. And everybody in Parliament House knows that. The third way that they get access is through this specialised ecosystem of lobbyists, which in the last 10 or 15 years have kind of evolved into full service communications consultancies. They will do your polling, your market research, your communications, they'll place your op-ed, they'll do social media disinformation or know who to talk to get your dark PR done, such that up to a quarter of tweets on any given day relating to climate change are being propagated by bots. So this incredibly important conversation that we are collectively as a species trying to have on these platforms is being swamped by disinformation. None of this is accidental. This serves a particular purpose. So the third way in which this occurs, or the third lens that we look at in the arms industry, well, actually all of them, but the arms industry and the fossil people in particular are extraordinarily adept at this, is through revolving doors, where there's a kind of circular career path from between industry, the communications and consultancy sphere, and politics, for senior advisors, for MPs, and particularly for ministers, like industry ministers or people who are regulators of these powerful sectors. After their political career, they go on, as Ian Macfarlane did, to run the Queensland Resources Council, or as Martin Ferguson did, you go and get on the board of a gas industry and join APPIA as an advisor. And they're all doing it. So you don't really have two distinct classes of industry and politics. You've got a single unified class that is kind of watched over with an eagle eye by the media. And so all the incentives kind of line up to just support industry. And there are plenty of examples of people who swim against the tide, Rudd and Gillard being two of them. And look what happened to them. That's partly what we're dealing with. It becomes kind of a political common sense after a while that you just don't rock the boat, either pre-election or once you're in government. That's what we're dealing with. The fourth lens we talk about is institutional repurposing, which is just a fancy term for taking an institution with a public purpose, like the Bureau of Meteorology or the CSIRO, or the people doing environmental impact assessment on mines, and you gradually unmoor it from its founding or its stated purpose. So one of the darkest examples I'm aware of is intelligence agencies that were tasked with spying on the East Timorese cabinet rooms when Alexander Downer was our foreign minister, and then passing what they had learned onto Woodside, who were at that point engaged in quite high-level negotiations over gas acreage access in the Timor Sea. And that's an example of an agency that's meant to be serving us in the national security space, protecting us from violent extremists, which is instead doing corporate espionage for the gas industry. That's repurposing. There are a ton of other examples. What's being done to the War Memorial, for example, is another one, where it's becoming just advertising collateral for arms exporters. There's a ton of examples in the report of institutional repurposing, which is both a cause and an effect of state capture. It's a circular process. The sixth lens over on the right is the research and policy making. A lot of this stuff happens in broad daylight. It's really prosaic. It can be the fact that these industry bodies have the resources to be at every Senate inquiry, to be at every Productivity Commission review, to set up their own reviews or committees like they did with the COVID Commission, which was just stacked out with gas industry people. It's also where you will find think tanks like the IPA, whose task really is to take very industry-friendly ideas and research, package it up, and launder it into the public debate, either through claims for free speech, which is where you get extremists like the IPA continually appearing on ABC's platforms, or the, you know, the really sensible looking stuff like McKinsey and the giant management consultants that wrote climate policy that we took to the Glasgow Climate Conference. So there's this huge infrastructure of policy and research that goes on that is then laundered into the public debate. And the final one that we talk about in the report are the public influence campaigns. This is the public track stuff. A lot of what we've talked about so far is very inside track and behind closed doors. This is what you will see on the front page of the Daily Telegraph day after day, just doing full-scale, full court press character assassination on people with unpopular ideas or doing stuff that they don't like. These things are synchronized, again, through these lobbyist/communications consultancies and the peak bodies, and they cover the bases from traditional media, social media, or really niche stuff. All of those 6 things, all of those channels being operated in sync. They don't treat them as separate channels. This is what it looks like, right? Day after day. If you're an environmental campaigner, if you're left of the Labor Party, if you're in the Greens, if you're doing any kind of advocacy work that's unpopular with some corner of corporate Australia, you can wind up on a front page that looks like this, day after day after day, and in an extreme concentrated media market. So what do we recommend? There are 4 things. As I said, they're pretty wide open. The first, I was going to pick favorites, but that's an incredibly dangerous thing to do. So I'll just say I love all of these recommendations equally. Here's the first one. 1, can you help us name it? Can you help us get this phrase into the public discourse? If you're online, use hashtag state capture on social media and help just feed it out like seeds. We're not going to get complimentary coverage in the Murdoch press on this one because they're part of the problem. So we're going to need to do this the old-fashioned way, through propagating our messages and sharing and passing it on. Naming it is powerful because it bundles up all these ideas into something that people can grapple with, and that makes it legible to ourselves and people working on different issues. So the first one's real simple. Please just help us name it. The second one is this exquisite work that's been done over a long period of time by the Australian Democracy Network and the Our Democracy campaign. It's called the Framework for a Fair Democracy. Saffron spoke of it in the introduction. And it's just all the best legal brains in the country that got together, including folk like Alice from Human Rights Law Centre, ACF, and other experts. What's the best case donations reform? What is the best case political communication laws look like? Or how do we stamp out revolving doors? How do we deal with donations? And it's the legislative response that we're calling on all candidates and MPs to get behind. And in the teeth of a federal election campaign, that's really worth a look. Ask your candidate. You know, there's a real mood for this stuff. So the Greens and a whole pile of these independents all running on integrity. So we feel as though the moment for this is really right. So that's recommendation 2. Like, really feed this into political debates. If you're at a town hall meeting, put your hand up, ask your candidates. The third one takes us back to this power map of the different sectors. And the third one is basically consequences. This isn't about marginal seats or political candidates. This is about taking the campaign up to the entities doing the capturing and creating costs and consequences for them. Whether that be any of the sort of stuff that you see environmental groups doing these days around Adani, for example, or Narrabri, or the stuff that's kicking off around Woodside's Scarborough Gas Project. In the Labor sphere, strikes or secondary boycotts, the kind of shareholder activism that Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility does, divestment campaigns, which again have been used to beautiful effect by the Adani folk. And up the very top there, under the customers, renewable energy, batteries, the nuclear ban treaty, anything that de-escalates tensions, arms embargoes, all of these things help erode the customer base for the industries that are doing so much harm. Alternative media over in the social license space, boycotting. So getting Woodside to drop its sponsorship of Fringe Festival in WA made a really powerful statement. We're going to have to do the same thing with Gina's sponsorship of the Olympics. It's ridiculous. You shouldn't be able to, in the same way that tobacco campaigners have just blown the tobacco industry out of the public sphere. You can't advertise, their packaging all looks like death. That's what we're talking about in the social license space. Everything that we do cumulatively helps erode that social license so that they can't do their stuff in public anymore and drive them out of the public sphere. And in the government space, like the beautiful work that EDO and allies do to cut industry off at its source, or, as is front of mind during an election campaign, parliamentary action. It's not all a corrupt mess. We have friends and allies in local, state and federal parliaments, and we have to help swell their numbers. And that's partly what we're hoping to do with this work. The fourth one is to protect a vibrant and diverse civil society. So the Hands Off Our Charities work that the ADN was spearheading late last year, they come after tax deductibility status. They try and tie us up in green tape and paperwork, and they try and split the movement. And so when we're under attack, when any corner of our movement is under attack,
oh no, Scott, your internet. Oh dear, and it's frozen at a not great moment too. Scott, can you hear us? Hey team, can we take Scott off until his video comes back, and we can just jump back into the presentation when his internet recovers? Beautiful. Tony, we're seeing a lovely picture of you there. Look, Scott's internet is really not great. So this has happened, I think, on every occasion when we've tried to do a webinar together. While we're waiting for him, I've actually been having some really strong flashbacks while listening to Scott talk, because I should out myself. I have actually worked as a lobbyist myself for the past 7 years before setting up Australian Democracy Network. I worked for the Australian Conservation Foundation, doing all of their government relations. And I have incredibly strong memories, particularly of the year 2016, when some of you might remember the reef had that catastrophic series of summer bleachings, and it became evident that it was in really serious trouble. And at that time, I was up at Parliament House trying to get all political parties to commit to science-based climate action, and all kinds of politicians really just absolutely refusing to go anywhere near it. It felt to me like the fossil fuels industry was with us in the room sometimes, and they've just set the boundaries about where political possibility ends, and no one will go past it. And then when you go and sit in the Parliament House cafeteria and have a cup of coffee, you see why, because those lobbyists actually do just pass you in fleets, like fleets from the Australian Business Council, from APIA, from the Minerals Council. And for every one person who's there advocating for the environment, you'll see on a given working day you're up at Parliament House that you're outnumbered 10 to 1. That's just a persistent experience for having spent time up there talking about these issues. So when we started the Our Democracy campaign, we actually brought together more than 30 different advocates who worked on all kinds of different issues, from corporate responsibility right through to human rights. And we mapped out this problem together, like, how do corporations exert their influence? What are all the different channels? What are all the unseen ways? Because we really wanted to understand the problem. And one of the reasons that I'm so excited that we finally have this 80-page document that explains how state capture works is that after that session, I felt like a bit overwhelmed, but also like, once you really understand the problem, then you can start designing strategic interventions to start winding it back. And so the point of putting this research together for me is really for all of us to understand what we're facing, so that we can design interventions together that will really make a difference. And if you are not up for reading the full 80 pages, there is this little cheat sheet that you can also download from the website, which is just 2 pages and does a really incredible job of summarizing the whole report. So at minimum, I need 315 people to leave this webinar tonight and go download that 2-page document. Do we have Scott back to finish up?
We do.
No, I think we should save the questions for Scott until we have Scott. So what I'm going to do is move on to Alice's presentation, and then we'll put all the questions into a big bundle at the end. So Alice's report is also incredibly useful piece of research, and you need to read that one as well. The Human Rights Law Centre is a really core collaborator of Our Democracy campaign. So Alice and I hang out together all the time. In fact, just this morning we were meeting with one of the independent candidates to brief them on our policies, because we think our policies are amazing and all candidates and parties should be adopting them in the lead up to the next election. So this report has been an incredible contribution for all Our Democracy partners to start building that body of evidence and the case studies that we need to tell the stories of corporate capture in a way that the whole country can understand and come together around solving. So super excited to hear Alice's presentation, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Saffron. Super excited to be here. And just because tech issues seems to be the theme of the last 3 years, I can't seem to present my slides as a normal presentation, so forgive me, you're just going to have to see it in a slightly awkward way. But yeah, so we've drafted up we've just launched the Selling Out report at the Human Rights Law Centre, and it goes through the levers of influence that 3 really big harmful industries have in Australia. The first one being fossil fuels, which we've talked about quite a bit already. The second being gambling, and the third being tobacco. So what's the problem with each of these industries? Australia is the worst performing country in the world with respect to taking action to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. So that means we're literally last of all countries in the world in terms of taking active steps to reduce our emissions. And that's coupled with the fact that we're also the highest, or among the highest, per capita CO2 emitters in the world. In addition to that, Australians lose more money to gambling per capita than any other people on the planet. The next ranked after us is people from Hong Kong, and they lose about 20% less than we do. So we're number one by a long way. And about 1.2 million Australians are currently or at risk of experiencing gambling harm. Third, in Australia, tobacco is also the leading cause of preventable death and disease. So tobacco use contributes to about 20,000 deaths per year, which is more than alcohol and illicit drugs combined. Big problems, shocking problems. What do Australians want to do about them? Well, on fossil fuels, there is support for stronger government action to stop runaway climate change in every single state and territory, and that concern is held by electorates that are both regional and metropolitan. So we know that there is support across the country for action on climate change. On gambling, there is overwhelming support for laws that will reduce gambling harm. Most of the harm is caused by pokies. So one thing that's really important to note is that about 77% of us want to see fewer pokies in the community. Finally, 60% of people support government policies to reduce tobacco-related harm, and more again support restrictions on vaping. So Australians want to see reforms to protect our communities and our planet. Why isn't our government doing anything? Obviously, as we've just heard from Scott's presentation, unfortunately, we as the voters are not the only ones who get a say. In fact, we're not even the priority. The fossil fuels, tobacco and gambling industries can't vote, but they well and truly get their message across by other means. And the 3 key, what we call the levers of influence, the 3 ways that they get their say is by funding the election campaigns of the major parties. So the major parties effectively become reliant on the political parties in order to form government and to get voted in. They also flood the halls of Parliament with lobbyists, and they hire former politicians. So Saffron's just told us about her experience of just watching these like waves of lobbyists come in into our Parliament in Canberra, and how deeply depressing that is, if any of you have been there. And this means that while each politician or each minister making really important decisions might meet with one person with lived experience or one community group, they're likely to meet with 100 representatives of the industry. And that means that industry values, like putting profits before people, becomes a cultural norm. And the third lever of influence that we're focused on, which in my opinion is actually in many ways the most important and impactful, is when push really comes to shove, they launch punishing public attack campaigns against politicians who try to regulate them. And this can be so damaging that now they often don't even need to run the campaign. They can just threaten to run a campaign against politicians, and that's enough to get them to back down and decide not to regulate the industry. Each of these three levers are used by each of the three industries that we address in the report, and they all work together. So you give donations so that you can get the meetings, and then when that fails, you can also run public attack campaigns. So what does the report do? The first thing it does is we've pulled together all of the stories that we might know of because we read the papers about the mining tax campaign 15 years ago. It pulls together all of these sort of piecemeal stories and pieces of research to show the overall pattern of behaviour across three of the most harmful industries in Australia. Definitely not the only industries that we could have written this report about. Scott's and ADN's report, of course, looks at the weapons industry, but there's others like those that run detention centres. I could write a list, but hopefully that'll be report 2.0. And then on the basis of this evidence, we've identified the legislative solutions that will stop this cycle of political influence. So this is what we're out there campaigning for. These are the changes that we want to see our politicians enact. And that is the framework for a fair democracy, which Saffron has already mentioned. So if you haven't seen the framework, it's really accessible. It's just a couple pages. Check it out on the Our Democracy website. And then third, most importantly, in my opinion, it talks about the people who've been impacted by gambling harm, by bushfires caused by climate change and by tobacco use, so that we can make this not just a sort of academic conversation about the health of our democracy, but we can ground it in people's lives. I was asked to think about a surprising find in all of this, and look, there was lots, or maybe not surprising, demoralising, but not surprising. But one thing that I thought I would share that I thought was quite interesting is harmful industries often don't exert their influence directly. What they do is they fund front groups, like Scott mentioned, these like industry peaks that are kind of like, I don't even like comparing them to trade unions, but that's kind of the function that they perform, is they'll fund these front groups that will then represent the industry as a whole. And this keeps their company brands at arm's length of all of the dirty work done by these front groups. And the front groups usually lead the charge with making political donations, lobbying, and with the public attack campaigns. And they're a really important tactic for all three of the industries. So we talk lots about political donations, rightly so, they're really important. We pulled together some of the data over the last 10 years from the biggest greenhouse gas emitters in Australia. And you'll see that they're significant sums. We're looking at $2.5 million over 10 years from Woodside that's to Labor, the Nationals and the Liberal Party. Similarly, $1.69 million from Santos. But this, I mean, bearing in mind this is only probably a fraction of what's actually being given because our donation laws are so weak, it also doesn't feel like this is the full story. And that's probably because it's not. If we compare the amount of political donations, it seems problematic. But if we then compare it to the contributions that they make to the Minerals Council of Australia, they're very quickly dwarfed. So this is just from 1 year, we can see $6.5 million was given by BHP to the Minerals Council, 6.4 million from Glencore, et cetera, et cetera. So comparing the 10-year data to just the 1 year data. And then what does Minerals Council of Australia do? Well, they make political donations as well to the Liberal Party almost exclusively, the Liberals and the Nats. But you might also remember them from many of the campaigns that have seen our very, very backwards position on climate action in this country. So there's MCA that was leading the charge to kill the super profits mining tax and Kevin Rudd's prime ministership. You might remember them from the multi-million-dollar campaign to kill the carbon price and the emissions trading scheme. You might remember them from the lump of coal tossed about by Scott Morrison in Parliament, which was the front page of our report. That was provided by Minerals Council. And then also the reason why we were so embarrassing at COP26. Also the gas-led recovery, which was supported by MCA and led by Happier, which is the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association. Similarly, in gambling, we see significant donations. So Crown Resorts has contributed $1.7 million over 10 years, Tabcorp $1.6 million. But a lot more money comes via the Australian Hotels Association, whose members include Tabcorp, so $7.5 million over 10 years, and Clubs New South Wales, $2.2 million over 10 years. So you might remember AHA and Clubs New South Wales from killing the Gillard-Wilkie reform attempts to make pokies less damaging. That's the $1 bet limit and pre-commitment limits. And also stopping ALP from winning in the Tasmanian election after the ALP had committed to remove pokies from communities and just keep them in casinos, which is already the policy where Scott and I are from, which is in WA. So these peaks, as I mentioned, really do all of the dirty work of each of those three levers combined: the political donations, the lobbying, and the public attack campaigns. And one story that I wanted to spend a little bit more time on, rather than just like reeling off a whole bunch of data at everyone, was the latest push by Big Tobacco. If you've not read John Saffron's puff piece, by the way, it's a really excellent profile of Philip Morris and its push for vaping. But to tell you a little bit about what I found. So Graham really kindly spoke to us for this report. He was 13 when he had his first cigarette, and he talks about how everybody around him smoked, from his parents and even his doctor smoked. And he, like all teenagers, wanted to be cool, and he looked to Paul Hogan in the 1970s with his Winfield cigarettes. Fast forward a few decades later, a few decades of smoking addiction, and Graham was left with tongue cancer and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So the tongue cancer meant that he had to have 35 bouts of extremely aggressive radiation that burnt the inside and the outside of his throat. And the pulmonary disease is with him now for life. That's permanent lung damage, which really restricts his ability to exercise and go about his life. It's been really devastating for him. And obviously, not just for Graham, but for many, many thousands of Australians across the country. And in fact, an estimated 1 billion people internationally. Only after tireless advocacy from public health experts over many decades did we see the incredibly improbable happen, and governments started to take action to stop people from taking up smoking and to help those who are already addicted to quit. This is in the face of huge campaigns, public campaigns, lobbying efforts, etc., particularly from Philip Morris, British American Tobacco and Imperial, that spent millions trying to oppose reforms like the plain packaging reforms. So in spite of all of this, we saw excellent advocacy turn the tables, which is really exciting and definitely something that we are hoping to follow. However, in the last few years, we've seen vaping and e-cigarette use really begin to change things. And tobacco use is on the rise incredibly quickly and alarmingly quickly among young people, which is, of course, the most important market for the tobacco companies. So vaping doubled among 14 to 17-year-olds and quadrupled among 25 to 29-year-olds between 2016 and 2019. So tobacco use is on the rise again. What's Philip Morris done? It's rebranded itself as a wellness company. It's claiming that it's now committed to a smoke-free world, so it's going to get rid of cigarettes, and instead it's developed this e-cigarette called the IQOS. It claims that it's a safer alternative because it heats the tobacco rather than burns it, and that this is an avenue to help people quit smoking. These health claims are very much contradicted by independent medical evidence, which shows a strong link to increased heart disease and lung disease and some initial evidence of connections to cancer. Obviously, these devices are so new that we still don't know the long-term impacts of them. But the Philip Morris has been incredibly aggressive in trying to stop the Australian government from regulating nicotine use and these new products. And so what we've seen them do is funnel hundreds of thousands of dollars through a peak organisation, the Australian Retailers Association, which then partnered with a US-style right-wing think tank, the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, to launch a significant lobbying campaign that targeted government backbenchers to push their pro-vaping lines and to find a champion, which was in Matt Canavan and Holly Hughes. They also continued to make strategic donations to the Nationals. It's worth noting that tobacco companies are considered so dirty that both the ALP and the Liberal Party have voluntarily instituted a ban on political donations. So that's why you see Philip Morris just making donations to the Nationals. And then finally, a big public campaign to promote the legalisation of vaping. And just in case we're in any doubt about vaping not being healthy for people and being a pretty dark space to be in, just provided here, much like Paul Hogan in the 1970s with his cigarettes, making smoking attractive to young people. Vaping, nicotine and the e-cigarette use is deliberately designed to be super attractive. They use bright colours and make them lolly-like flavours to make young people more addicted. So ultimately, the campaign was pretty successful. They managed to convince 28 coalition backbenchers to write to Greg Hunt to delay the proposed nicotine import ban. And then they got a Senate inquiry up and running, which gave them a platform to talk about how great their products are. They've managed to split the Liberal Party on it, and they've won the support of the Nationals. They didn't win all of the reforms that they wanted. They won a couple of them, but the really scary thing is that they're still trying, so they could still win. What's the key takeaway from all of this? There's a human cost to corporate influence, and we need to be highlighting these stories to make it real for our community. And we have the policy solutions. All we need is the public pressure, which is why we are going to ask you to join us at Our Democracy if you haven't already, to stay involved if you're sort of already a devotee. We can't wait to work with you ahead of the election to make this a reality.
Thank you, Alice. And if you haven't seen it before, this is the framework. Go find it at our website. And unfortunately, I only have a black and white copy of your report, Alice, so I can't hold it up because it isn't pretty. So we don't have as much time for questions as I wanted, but I'm going to get through as many as I can. So here is one that you can both have a crack at. What are the top 5 things that could be achieved in the next few years that would make Australia more democratic? Scott, you've had a break from talking. Do you want to try that one first?
5 is so specific. All right, we'll try and keep it realistic. So the first thing that could happen is that we could have a change of government in less than 90 days' time, however long we have, that fills the parliament up, both chambers, with independents, Greens and people who aren't taking money from any of the folk that Alice or I have spoken of tonight. So a big rainbow crossbench of people who aren't captured is the first thing that could happen. A, because that would just be great intrinsically. B, it sends a serious message into the major parties and helps our allies inside the major parties. Like, it would be a big shift if we're able to do that. That's my first one. And then they have to start legislating stuff. They would need to introduce a national ICAC that won't deal with the broader field of things that we've discussed, the things that aren't technically corruption, which I believe are actually deeper than the things that are. But it would be a huge step forward. And a culmination of more than a decade's work. So that's 2. 3, to make us more democratic, this is me without my Greens hat on, without an ADN hat on, without any hats on at all. This is just me. I think the best thing that could happen would be a wave of bankruptcies across fossil fuel sectors and the arms industry. Like, that we actually have to go quite hard, with the kind of shareholder activism and so on, but also the various kind of things that movements are able to do to revoke the social license and also make the economic case. There's a profound business case here that investors are going to lose a huge amount of money if they stick with these industries. So, anything that we can do to weaken the support base of the industries doing the capturing. I might stop there at 3 because I could keep going in that vein, but those would be the kind of first things that come to mind.
Thank you, Scott. And I know many of you on the call will share Scott's enthusiasm for Rainbow Crossbench. So I should just say, as a charity, Australian Democracy Network is a non-partisan organisation, and we would never tell people who to vote for or support particular parties or candidates.
I didn't either. I was really good.
Absolutely. And I'm sure that your comments are broadly supported in the room. Alice, what are your 5 things?
My 5 things. If I take my lawyer hat off for a moment, I would say to have a culture in Australia where people really feel the political hit when they do the wrong thing, when they engage in corruption, when they take dodgy donations, or when they're not transparent with their donations. And I think we're seeing that happening increasingly, which is really exciting. In terms of law reforms, I would say everything in the framework for a fair democracy is important. But if I'm pushed, we need caps on political donations, so that just can't have that kind of corrupting influence. We need greater transparency around our political donations so that we know who is having that influence. Really vitally, we also need lobbying to be made transparent so we know who's meeting with our decision makers and trying to influence them. And then we'd also have caps on election spending to try and stop those big public campaigns that I was talking about, try and nip them in the bud and try and prevent them from placing undue pressure on politicians to not regulate industries, and also to stop the likes of Clive Palmer giving himself $84 million to spend in an election.
Great. Alice, I've got another one for you. How do we stop the revolving door between politics and industry? What do we do?
Great question. So what we need is a strong, enforceable cooling off period, and it should be instituted. We've set the level at around about 3 years, and what that means is you have a regulator that says to politicians, particularly ministers and their senior staff, you are not allowed to leave public office and then go and work for the industry that you previously regulated for 3 years after leaving office.
Yeah, that's the great thing about a lot of these reforms. Like, they're actually just very obvious and simple. We know what to do. All that's lacking is political will. And in some ways, that's a great story because political will is a thing that we can create together. So a lot of this is just solvable. All we need is a decision to do it. Okay, this one is for both of you to have a crack at. Let me pull just up so I don't mangle the question. Reform in the tobacco space took decades and industry have gotten smarter in the meantime. How do we speed up reform? Great question. We don't have decades up our sleeves. Scott, do you want to go first? And then I'll come to you, Alice.
I would say 2 things quickly. One is to acknowledge how far we've come. Like, both of these reports paint a pretty bleak picture and there's no sugarcoating in either of them. But let's also acknowledge that we have had really powerful wins, and we are on our way. We do, in some sense, have the wind at our backs, whether it be in the political, the investor side, the civil society side. I'm actually really optimistic. I'm more optimistic coming out of the process of helping pull this document together than I was going in. So yes, we don't have long. I think in terms of looking forward, we use this moment, this electoral moment where people's minds are focused on politics, which is a temporary thing, and there's only so far we can take it. And then the day after that, we get back to work. What we're hoping is that naming it as state capture helps speed that process. It acts as a bit of a catalyst. It did in South Africa. And we're not imagining it'll be exactly the same process here, but name it, pass it on, talk to people, and let's just help get those seeds out there that'll grow into something. I agree with the urgency that was expressed in the sense of the question, though.
Absolutely. Alice?
I think I'm here, and I know lots of us are here because issues-based reform is taking decades. And so the solution to that, the reason why it's taking decades is we're up against big industry. So what do we do about big industry? We cut them off at the knees and we stop their political power. And so I actually think that a campaign like this will take much less time because it's intuitive. It's hard for, we've got the public behind us, and it's really hard for companies to argue for their political donations to remain secret. And then so the idea is once we win this campaign, we start to see win after win after win in all of the other areas much more quickly.
Great. Okay. Next one is also an excellent question. Why do our political parties charge so little for pay to play? 110K is the platinum tier, and you can get billion-dollar projects approved. So what are we missing? Why are they so cheap? Go on, Scott, you're unmuted.
No, they're just cheap people. I just think it's scaled to the size of the media market. Look at how much money washes through the American political system. It's an order of magnitude, it's 2 or 3 orders of magnitude greater. Election campaigns there do run into the billions of dollars. So here it's scaled to, well, what's the cost of a TV buy in a major metro market? What's the cost of saturation online advertising? And I guess these companies pay as little as they think they can get away with to get an outcome. So it's, an economist would say, that's the price signal. That's as much as it costs to buy your outcome. But what you see actually, and in recent research, is that I don't know if it was CPI or Alice, you probably recall, who did the recent research where they've just mapped the zigzag of donations. In election years it spikes, in up years it gets lower, or you'll get these unusual surges like when the mining tax was introduced, when they really go on the front foot. I think partly it's cheap because they know they don't have to do that anymore. So we know what the price of demolishing Kevin Rudd was. We know what the price of wrecking the Clean Energy Act was. That's like potential money that doesn't need to be spent anymore, which is very difficult to quantify. They know they could run the scare campaign if they have to, and mostly they don't. Yeah,
such a good point. Alice?
Just agree. They don't give that much anymore because they don't need to. It doesn't, the relationship is understood and the culture is so poor that actually they barely need to give anymore in order to get what they want.
Okay, let's try this one. How do we defeat corporate capture while we live under a duo corporate media capture? Do you want to take this one first, Alice?
I'm nodding my head vigorously. It doesn't mean that I necessarily know the answer to it. It is a great question, and we really undenied about whether or not to include media regulation in the framework. And we decided 11 asks was probably enough, but this is a hugely important piece of it. And I think there's some really great work being done out there on ensuring that there's less media ownership concentration in Australia, that investigative journalism is stronger. One piece that we may well end up looking at is ensuring that there's an enforceable code of conduct that applies to all journalists. And hopefully that would definitely soften some of the worst excesses of the kind of pro-coalness of Murdoch. yeah, it's something that Scott addressed in ADN's report. That's a really big part of the problem.
Scott?
It is a hard one. I've got a couple of thoughts. One is that we do live in a country where there are working journalists who work their butts off trying to get these stories out, support them and amplify them, share them. Alice got a fantastic piece up in The Guardian when that report was released, like really detailed, straight up. If you didn't share that, go find it and share it. So we do have access to outlets and journalists who will run our stuff. When you see it, help amplify it. Or when you see like experiments in alternative media, so one in the national security space that I'm obviously thinking about a lot, as are some of the folk on this call, is WikiLeaks. When you get a new form of publishing that takes on powerful people directly, and then the counterattack comes, rally around and protect. It's that fourth recommendation.
Yeah, open civic space is something that's easier to protect than to get back once you've lost it 100%.
Completely, yeah.
Alice, someone wants to know whether any of the independent candidates or political parties have adopted Australian Democracy Network, our democracy recommendations.
Yeah, this is a good question for you as well, Saffron. Look, we've had a few meetings now and it's looking really promising. I think we've had really positive reception to it. So yeah, definitely making really important, hopeful inroads there. I should also acknowledge that the Greens support a lot of what's in the framework already. The ALP has agreed to, it's already sort of reflected in some of their policy asks, but we've got a long way to go. To round it out, obviously the coalition have a very substandard federal ICAC. But yeah, in terms of the independence, it's looking really promising.
Yeah, it's one of the most inspiring pieces of this whole thing, just how organically this movement that sees a connection between climate inaction and integrity issues in our political system as connected, and how solving one is going to unlock the potential to solve the other one. So final question, because I want to wrap us up on time. What did you learn whilst doing this research that makes you feel hopeful? Alice, do you want to try this one first?
I sure can. I feel really hopeful that we have the solutions. I feel really hopeful that the tide is turning. And I feel really inspired by the public health experts who managed to make smoking so demonised, and tobacco companies so much the like kind of evil ones that they are in the public consciousness, that we actually saw wins despite big public pressure campaigns from big tobacco. We saw governments, including the coalition government, hold firm and regulate that space properly. Obviously vaping, we've got a new challenge, but I think that's what gave me the most hope, that we can win this campaign. And then those awesome advocates in the space of fossil fuels, weapons, gambling can continue to do their job.
Scott, what made you feel hopeful?
What made me feel hopeful was the sense of like lifting the rock and looking at them all scurrying around in the light. It's like, okay, the legibility helped me. Like, we can understand what these people do. A lot of it's under cover of darkness. Lift the rock up and learn how they operate, and suddenly it looks kind of prosaic and lame. It's like, we really can disrupt this. And the second thing was, from the fossil perspective, was understanding the reason that they're driving so hard into state capture is that they're being smashed. Investors are no longer interested. You know, the fossil fuel industry absolutely has the smell of death about it. The only way they can survive is by getting the feds to insure them and build gas pipelines for them. Like, I know it's a bit of a dark irony, but we're winning. That's the reason they're so desperate to capture the state. So we just have to press on.
Amazing. Alice and Scott, thank you so much for presenting your work to us tonight. I'm pretty sure I can speak for everyone. We learnt heaps, and also thank you so much for the late nights and the many, many hours that it takes to put together a careful, thoughtful, substantial piece of research, like both of these reports really are. If you feel like giving our presenters a clap, you can do that in the chat. They probably can't see your face, so clapping or waving won't be seen. I am now going to hand over to our colleague Isabella, who has some next steps for us.
Thanks, Saffron, and thanks so much, Scott and Alice, for joining us. Always a pleasure to hear your reflections, and I'm really excited about having these reports and being able to use them in our advocacy in the months to come. Hi, everyone. Even more excited to be here with you all. My name's Isabella. I'm the digital campaigner at the Australian Democracy Network and have been working to support people to take action on the Our Democracy campaign to start to break apart this really wicked problem of state capture. And for those who are new to us and our organisation who joined via this webinar for the first time, by signing up, you have joined our list and we'll be in touch with opportunities to get involved regularly. But I'm hoping we can all take a moment to do a small action together tonight, right now. So Scott spoke to 4 recommendations around fighting state capture that are in the ADN report. The first of which is kind of devilish in its simplicity, I think, which is to recognise state capture as a systemic threat to Australian democracy and to call it out. So, you know, we've got these excellent new reports. We've been sharing them. I'm going to tell you a little bit about something that happened to me today, which is that I've just been slamming my Instagram with the posts and telling people to check it out and share it and, you know, do it for me, even if you don't care about state capture, the whole thing. And I had a lunch break with my friend today, and she said to me, like, hey, I've never heard of this thing before, state capture. Like, did you guys make that up? So, like, you know, it's so fascinating. Like, finally, there's this word that describes all these problems that we see in politics. And, you know, it really reminded me of your work in the climate movement. And I was thrilled, obviously. And I think it's just kind of a good example of how, you know, sometimes I think it feels like maybe sharing on social media is a little bit naff or a little bit ineffective, but you personally really have the greatest influence over the people who know you. And by sharing this information and some of your personal reflections, you can really reach people and activate them. And so what I was hoping we could do is just spend, I want you to all spend one quick moment reflecting on something that you heard tonight, or maybe that you saw in the reports that you found really powerful, maybe really infuriating, maybe really hopeful, just something that stood out to you from the reports. And I'll pause while you do that and maybe ask Tony to bring up my slide, which is the 3rd one in the Slido slide deck.
I have to admit, as soon as you say that, my stomach just drops. Like, it's like cue Zoom fail.
Ye of little faith, Saffron. Thank you, Tony. So I hope you all have your reflections. If you don't, you still have time. And Cheryl is going to post for me a couple of links in the chat, which will take you to your social media of choice. So we've got a post on Twitter, we've got a post on Facebook, and we've got a post on Instagram, which have these great little explainers that kind of summarize state capture and what it is and what we can do about it. And what I'd like us to do all together, not sure if you can hear really loudly, my neighbour's bringing the bin in, sorry. But what I'd like us to do all together is choose the post that's your preferred social media platform and share it with your reflection about what it is that you found powerful about this news, or about the expression state capture, maybe about some work you've been doing. I know a lot of you have been working on this issue for a long time. And we've got some hashtags there as well, state capture and our democracy. And I'll give you a moment to do that before I know inevitably says something in the chat about how evil the social media platforms are. I know And they are huge corporates, and they're examples of huge corporates that use their muscle against our government. We saw that just last year with the news legislation. But let's face it, they're also a useful tool and a great way to spread info and reach people, you know, in your life. So I'm going to give you a couple of moments to do that. And just say that, yeah, maybe something that happened today. You may have seen some in the news, some interesting movement on one of the asks in the Framework for a Fair Democracy, where there's been some commitments made around donations transparency. And so we're putting together a little action, a little advocacy action for that as well. So if social media is not really your thing, or you're super keen to do more straight away, keep an eye on your inbox for that, and we'll be sending out that action tomorrow. These dark donations and lack of transparency is one of the kind of levers that are really at play with state capture. So one of the things that we're keen to break down. And otherwise, I'll hand back to you for some closing thoughts, Saffron. Thanks, everyone.
Amazing, and thanks for staying with us. An hour and a half is a big dose of Zoom, but just really delighted that we met so many new folks on the call tonight, and that people who've come a few times are still showing up. It's just so wonderful. I feel like we have this real moment ahead of us now where the whole nation is starting to think and talk about the problems with our democracy, and where our political parties and candidates in the next election are really tuning in to what people have to say about this, because they have to win our votes. So just a really huge opportunity for us to make this such a big issue that nobody can ignore it, and change the political landscape so that the next parliament that we elect is in a position where it becomes extremely costly to them to continue to do nothing about these problems. To make that happen, we really need all of us. We have a plan, but we can't execute it without a lot of people. So please head on over to the Our Democracy website and let us know what you'd like to do. There's a form there where we can be in touch. We've got heaps of cool things in the pipeline coming up, like just in a matter of weeks, because as you know, time is relatively short. So just love to keep on working together. That is the way that we will win. There's nothing about this problem that's not soluble. In fact, compared to some of the other things that are wrong with our world right now, this one is actually not that difficult. A little bit of people power will get the big money out and the people back in, and that's what a healthy democracy looks like. So I feel really hopeful because I do think that we can do it together. And I've just been so astonished by the wave of enthusiasm that we've seen across the country for doing something about this stuff. I really feel optimistic that we can fix it, and we'll do that together. And then we'll have a democracy that really does put us and our kids and the planet first, and that's the way we all want it to be. So thank you so much for joining us. We will be in your inbox tomorrow, and I can't wait to see #StateCapture trending over all the platforms like crazy for the next 24 hours. Please go forth and tweet and post like crazy, and we'll have a non-social media based action for you next time. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.